to Unpacked Rights, the podcast where we unravel the intricacies of human rights and international politics within the United Nations. I'm Yoni Ish-Hurwitz, your host, and I'm here to make it simple. With a background that spans diplomacy, activism, and entrepreneurship, I've worn every hat you can imagine in the service of the global community, so I hope I can speak to you too. Today, I'd like to tackle a topic that's been making headlines: the protests against Israel on campuses. Now, I'll be honest, discussing this as an Israeli might raise some eyebrows, but rest assured, I'm committed to providing a factual analysis despite my opinions. Over the past decade, whether as a UN officer or through my organization, the Human Rights Like-Minded Office, I've been credited for providing objective insights even on contentious issues like this one. Given the rampant misinformation surrounding Israel and Palestine, I believe it's crucial to contribute informed perspectives. While I acknowledge my biases, I pledge to present all sides of the debate, focusing on the facts through a human rights lens. And after setting the groundwork, we'll circle back to examine the United Nations approach to addressing the protests, the war in Gaza, and more broadly, the organization's approach to Israel even before the October 7 massacre. So let's dive in and unpack the protests against Israel on campuses. Let's talk about the protests against Israel on campuses. The one on the top of the news has been the protest in Columbia University in New York. So that's also the one I'll be mostly referring to, though it's actually representing of many other protests that by now have spread throughout the US and also in many other countries. So let's talk about what happened and what are the concerns relating to the restriction of protest rights and antisemitism in those protests. So you've seen the protesters actually not acting so peacefully as some claim. They took over buildings, they destroyed property. The building in Columbia University that they barricaded looks like a war zone now. Of course, they've broken through windows to get in. And now, on top of taking over property, refusing ultimatums from the university administration to evacuate, there have also been acts of violence against Jewish students. There's been a lot of intimidation. They've been denying Jewish students access to the library or to wherever they needed to go on campus, simply on the basis of their race. Now, I know there's a counter argument that it's only against Zionists, it's not against Jews per se. But wait, first of all, so there's no freedom of opinion, or there is? Isn't that the main claim, to protect freedom of opinion, freedom of speech? And actually, when you are saying you're against Zionists, I don't know how they manage really to make that a pejorative, but actually it is referring to most Jews. And what does it even mean? Zionism is simply the national movement of Jews. It's simply a call to respect, to fulfill Jews' right to self-determination, like any other people. Have you ever seen anyone objecting to Mexicans' right to self-determination? Or Americans' right to self-determination? Germans? Jordanians? No, only Jews are the exception. Another claim that is related to that is about colonialism. So they say, oh, Jews have taken over Israel. Jews should go back to Poland. Well, Jews are actually the only ones who ever had a state in Israel, more than once. All of the empires came and left. The colonizers came and left, and are gone. But in between, what they did ethnic cleansing of the land of Canaan or Israel or any other name that it had at the time. The, the people of Israel have been displaced from their own land twice in history. First by the Babylonians and second by the Romans. And they came back. And actually throughout history they maintain some Jewish presence in Israel. Palestinians are actually a more recent phenomenon in the land of Israel or Palestine. And if anything, the Arabs were also among the colonizers. So let's actually go through history. There was Canaan, there was then Israel and Judea. There were the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, bless them. Koresh let the people of Israel come back. There were the Greeks, and again, the Jews, and then the Romans, the Byzantines, different Arab dynasties from Egypt or Kurds. Sorry if I don't know exactly the details of all of that, but there were a few dynasties that actually competed with each other. There were the Crusaders, then the Mamluks, the Ottomans, and then the Brits, and then Israel again. So lots of empires, one people that had a state. So they say go back to Poland, which actually, considering the history of Poland, can be extremely intimidating for Jews. But many Israelis actually originate in the Middle East. So if you want to talk about ethnic cleansing, that actually defines it, where you had large Jewish communities throughout the Arab world, more than 700,000 people. And today, in each and every of those countries, there are very few. In most of them, you can count the Jews in the country on one hand. That's not what happened with Arabs in Israel. The Arab population in Israel greatly increased since Israel was founded. Obviously, the same is true in Gaza and the West Bank. What else are they claiming? They're claiming genocide in Gaza. Don't get me wrong. What's happening in Gaza is terrible. It is a catastrophe by any definition. But the one who's really claiming, propagating genocide is the hugely discredited Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, which focuses on the Palestinian territories. And she's had some anti Semitic remarks in the past. So she has been criticized by some ambassadors as well. What else have they said? So the protests are calling for intifada. And I've seen online on Twitter an Arab professor saying, "What? How dare you now define for us what intifada means?" Well, we've had two intifadas in Israel, and they were definitely not peaceful. So we understand call for intifada as call for immediate violence, and I'm sure that everyone else takes this as a call to violent action right now. So in really enough with the gaslighting. I think we know enough when someone is intimidating us with violence. If we need anything more than that, there's the slogan from the river to the sea, which is also visually depicted by the flag of Palestine, covered the entire territory of Israel, not only the Palestinian part. That means taking over our land, our ancestral land, a part of Israel. That that is genocidal. That is ethnic cleansing, because we know we would not be allowed to live under a Palestinian Israel. There are, like I said, no Jews hardly in other Arab countries. There's no Jew in Ramallah, I promise you. Definitely none in Gaza, except for the hostages. If you can imagine, there are actually more violent or clear statements in those protests supporting terrorism. So we've seen protesters waving the flags of Hamas and Hezbollah, which are designated by the US as terrorist groups. We know what Hamas has done in Israel, and some of the protesters have pointed to Jewish individuals on campus and said these are the next targets of Hamas. They they have been as clear as possible that they are calling for violence. Now let's look at what the High Commissioner for Human Rights has said about these protests. So just to bring it back to the UN, he said he was troubled by law enforcement actions against protesters at universities. If you look up that phrase, you'll be able to find his statement, which has a lot of interesting parts. I'll go through them for good and bad. So he starts with saying what's freedom of expression, and then he says, many of the protests have been held without incident, but in others, there were arrests and suspensions. So he's referring to incidents just as those arrests and suspensions. But what about the incident where the protesters were violent? Why not speak about that? Then he says anti Semitic conduct and speech were totally unacceptable and deeply disturbing. Finally, however, he immediately balances that, as they say at the UN, with a reference to the Arabs. So anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian conduct and speech were equally reprehensible. It's not enough to speak about anti-Semitism, as if there is any comparison. If you look at the data, the amount of hate crimes against Jews compared to Muslims or Arabs in the US and in other countries, there's nothing to compare, especially since October 7th. Then he says something that I really want to stress. I wish it wasn't lost in the rest of the verbiage. He says incitement to violence or hatred on grounds of identity or viewpoints, whether real or assumed, must be strongly repudiated. We have already seen such dangerous rhetoric can quickly lead to real violence. So I want to stress that again. Us Jews see it all the time. I don't understand why others don't. And we've seen that violence already on campus. But again, he says, we have already seen such dangerous rhetoric can quickly lead to real violence. Then he goes into the basics, standard principles of human rights that are important when you speak about peaceful assembly and freedom of speech. So any restrictions of freedom of expression or right to peaceful assembly must be strictly guided by the principles of legality, necessity, and proportionality, and also applied without discrimination. Great. And also, fair enough, he said that the conduct, this incitement to violence, must be addressed individually rather than through sweeping measures. I think that what we've seen was taking case by case, suspending or expelling or arresting people that were seen as committing crimes, like barricading in that building in Columbia University. Then he said, legitimate exercises of the freedom of expression cannot be conflated with incitement to violence and hatred. I think this goes both ways. It is really mind boggling why so many people, including human rights organizations, fail to distinguish between incitement and free speech, between a riot and a peaceful assembly. That's why I was especially encouraged to see the report from Human Rights Watch, from the UN Director, Louis Charbonneau, titled UN Universities Should Respect Right to Protest. That is their general line, but they finally say there have been troubling reports of anti-Semitic incidents in and around Columbia University's campus. Thanks, by the way, for following me, Human Rights Watch. If you also want to follow more of my comments on the topic, I'm at Ish-Hurwitz on Twitter. One word, no hyphen. Now, the person that really captured my thoughts on this was President Biden. Have a listen.
Look, it's basically a matter of fairness. It's a matter of what's right. There's the right to protest, but not the right to cause chaos. People have the right to get an education, the right to get a degree, the right to walk across the campus safely without fear of being attacked. Let's be clear about this as well. There should be no place on any campus, no place in America for anti-Semitism or threats of violence against Jewish students.
Going back to the article from Human Rights Watch, it provides a good segue for the next topic I want to address before talking about how the UN is addressing Israel more broadly. So, Human Rights Watch concludes by saying, as protests spread to campuses across the country, university administrations should be careful not to mislabel criticism of Israeli government policies or advocacy for Palestinian rights as inherently anti-Semitic. Let's address now the claim that anti-Semitism may be used to silence criticism of Israel. It comes up a lot in the context of the protests on campuses, and it also came up following the adoption of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act in Congress in the US, and now before it goes to the Senate. So if you just look online at complaints against this bill, they're actually bringing together the racists from the far left and the far right. They're outraged. What? You can't say that Jews control Congress or that Jews control the academia or the media? Or what? You can't say that Jews are responsible for killing Jesus? I sure hope that this bill will help raise awareness to anti-Semitism. But those that are more sophisticated say, what? You can't criticize Israel? And that is actually a lie, because this bill sticks to the definition of the IHRA, that's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and that definition doesn't say anywhere that you can't criticize Israel. A lot of governments endorse this definition, including the US and Israel, but also many European countries, as well as Argentina, Colombia, Panama, the Philippines, South Korea, and Uruguay, among others. It was also endorsed by the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion, Ahmed Shahid, who is the former foreign minister of the Maldives. One more thing that proves to me that this claim is disingenuous is that a year ago, when Israel was going through the judicial reform, which should be a concern for democracy and human rights by all of those human rights organizations that are now speaking against this definition or claiming that anti-Semitism could be misused. All of these organizations had nothing to say about the judicial reform at the time. If you go to some of the larger ones that for sure address Israel a lot, or at least when it comes to the Palestinian side, on a weekly basis even, but go through their newsletters, through their blog posts, press releases in 2023, and I guarantee you won't find much about the judicial reform. You'd be lucky to find anything. So here was a perfect opportunity to criticize Israel, which they didn't. You know who did criticize Israel for that? Biden did, Macron did, Scholz did. The EU also criticized Israel for that, or Netanyahu's government. None of them was labeled as anti-Semitic. A year ago, those organizations, including Human Rights Watch and many BDS organizations, called on the UN Secretary General not to endorse the IHRA definition. Their complaint actually wasn't that the IHRA definition doesn't allow for criticism of Israel. They were only complaining that it could be misused. Now, honestly, at the time that anti-Semitism was already on the rise, even before the October 7 massacre, don't we need more tools to fight anti-Semitism? Now, where we are now, that it has skyrocketed so much, don't you feel bad that you tried to stymie such efforts at the time? Moving on to our last topic for today, looking at how the UN addresses Israel. I think most of us, not only Israelis, didn't need October 7 to know that the UN has a bias against Israel. Let's look at the three most notorious examples, I think. There's the Human Rights Council, the Durban Declaration, and General Assembly resolution equating Zionism and racism. So first, the Human Rights Council is known for having more resolutions on Israel than on any other country. It also has an agenda item that is dedicated for Israel, while all other countries are addressed by other agenda items. There's more to say about the mechanisms that were created to investigate Israel that have some special features that are unlike other mechanisms, but never mind the details. The second thing is the Durban Declaration. That's the main way the UN addresses racism since 2001. It could have been a great platform for fighting racism, except it was contaminated from day one with not only politicization, but actually racism, I would say that. So one part of it was a lot of intimidation that took place at the conference in Durban in South Africa back in 2001, and there were more incidents in the anniversaries, something related to Iran and Ahmadinejad. But the Durban Declaration and Program of Action itself has a problem that I can tell you that colleagues, diplomats ask me to this day, what is Israel's problem with Durban? And that is that it mentions the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as if it is a racist conflict or a conflict based on race rather than a political conflict like any other conflict in the world. So essentially, it's saying that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is unique. That is, to me, the most blatant manifestation of racism. And that is why Israel and many other countries could never accept and support resolutions on this topic. The sad thing is that Israel has actually made overtures to South Africa, who's leading on the resolution on racism or the follow up to Durban, but South Africa could never bring itself to compromise. The last thing I mentioned, the General Assembly resolution equating Zionism and racism back in 1975 was overturned only in 1991. That resolution was passed through the third committee. That's the committee that is focused on human rights. That's the committee that I used to work on. And a lot of the work that I do today is still focused on that committee. To me, it's a huge stain on that committee. We can only be thankful that that was overturned in 1991. And yet, we see how this bogus claim is coming up again, and Zionism is somehow used as a negative word, which I explained before why that actually shows that whoever is using that negatively doesn't really support human rights for all without discrimination. But there are so many more examples. The Commission on the Status of Women has a resolution on Palestinian women, but no other women. Actually, I was waiting to see when will there be a resolution again on Afghan women, because there was one in the first Taliban regime. There's another resolution from the Economic and Social Council on the economic and social repercussions of the Israeli occupation on the living conditions of Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territories and Syrian Golan. Can you just think for a moment if you can really compare the economic and social condition of anyone in the Syrian part that is controlled by Syria of the Golan and the Israeli controlled part? That to me makes no sense at this day and age. The whole definition of a Palestinian refugee is different from how the UN treats any other refugee from any other country. So instead of looking for solutions for Palestinian refugees, resettling them somewhere, it can be in a new country where they are, or in a third country. That's how it's done with any other refugee. But with them, their problem is perpetuated. The UN is giving a free pass to Israel's neighbors, not to resettle them, not to give them citizenship, not to allow them equal rights to employment. For generations, people can live in Lebanon for years and not receive the same rights just because they're Palestinian. Now, moving on to since October 7, the picture actually gets so much darker. I think what people know best is how UN Women failed Jewish victims of the massacre. For over 50 days, UN Women had nothing, almost nothing to say about them. I can tell you that even since then, they haven't said so much. A bit. That when Israeli women's organizations coined the term Me Too, unless you're a Jew. It really felt that way. And I'm sorry to say that while UN Women was in the forefront, while sexual violence was the most horrible feature of the massacre, that actually cuts across the board throughout the UN and specifically the human rights community within the UN, because all of them almost all of them, certainly in the first couple of months, have completely ignored victims in Israel, which, by the way, included not only Jews and also not only Israelis, but people from many nationalities. UNICEF equally welcomed the release of civilian hostages, including children, babies, and terrorist prisoners that were released from Israel in that hostage deal. So we're talking about violent prisoners that were released, and the UN, UNICEF felt compelled to welcome that just as they welcomed the release of civilian hostages. Now, I think the place where things really turned south was from when the Secretary General of the UN said this didn't happen in a vacuum. In the first few days after the massacre, I was actually also commenting on his statements and the statements of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which seemed a little better than others. But then came this, which was rightly understood in Israel as justifying the massacre. Nothing that was in his statement to say that he did not justify that was enough to go back from that statement. And since then, there seemed like there was a shift in the rhetoric from the Secretary General and a huge rift between Israel and him and the whole UN leadership. There are others that are far more out there from the human rights experts of the Human Rights Council. So the one most discredited, also criticized by the US ambassador to the Human Rights Council, Michelle Taylor, the special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, said, I'm translating here from French, she replied to President Macron, "No, Monsieur Macron, the victims of October 7 were not killed because of their Judaism, but as a reaction to Israeli oppression." Well, the Special Rapporteur on Health, Tlaleng Mofokeng from South Africa, has been tweeting nonstop about Gaza, but has practically nothing to say for the victims of the massacre in Israel. Nothing to say about national trauma, no recommendations for how the government of Israel could address it when a fifth of the country's population are suffering from PTSD. Nothing to say about the health consequences of new forms of psychological violence by Hamas against the families of victims that received calls and videos from Hamas to show them how their loved ones were brutalized. He's only tweeting for Palestinian victims. Just now, on May 1st, she tweeted what Google translates from Zulu as "she is drunk," where she's referring to CNN reporter Dana Bash, who was showing the images from campus protests and tweeting, "Destruction, violence, and hate overtake college campuses across the country, with Jewish students feeling unsafe at their own schools. It is unacceptable and hearkening back to the 1930s in Europe." So, what is most terrorizing, what are the greatest fears for Jewish students and frankly for all of us Jews, is completely dismissed and mocked by the Special Rapporteur on Health. There are more examples. Some are not as blunt. A lot are simply ignoring the Israeli victims altogether, even though they are addressing the situations of Palestinians. Palestinians, yes. Israelis, no. To conclude, maybe on a better note, there are a few things that were done by the UN, like the visit in Israel by the special representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence in conflict, Pramila Patten. She said she was shocked by the national trauma that she saw. On this point, I want to say, more on a personal note, no one escapes this national trauma. I felt it also from afar. So I want to say also for anyone that needs counseling, that feels the impact, one tip I can recommend is go to betterhelp.com/Israel support. They offer 6 months free for professional counseling from licensed therapists. I personally feel deeply disappointed by the UN. This is the environment I've been working in since the end of 2010. I've been working there to promote the human rights of everyone. I never, ever thought that the entire system could ignore my human rights as well. I want to say to everyone that is listening to this, whether you're from the UN community or not, think about your Jewish friends. We've all experienced this national trauma. You don't have to agree with our government's policies. You can be very concerned about Palestinians in Gaza, but you can also care for your Jewish friend and just send a message to inquire how are they doing, how are their friends or family members in Israel. Thank you.